If you plan on buying property after the stock market crash that's probably coming in 2021 and you're going to scoop up a bunch of property and become a landlord, great, you're smart, you have 200 IQ, awesome. But if you plan on doing the same thing that everybody else is doing with their real estate once they buy it and getting a regular tenant and then holding onto it for multiple years as prices come up and then maybe selling them at a profit, 5-10 years down the road, you're doing it wrong. You're just absolutely doing your real estate strategy wrong and you need to change your plan. Buy the property, sure, but do something else with it. Now, this will apply to you if you're going to be a new landlord, or if you have a portfolio already. You should have been paying attention to this a long time ago and you're late to the dinner party. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about why your tenant strategy needs to change. You need to make more money on your properties, and getting a regular tenant is not good enough. And there's a lot of risk right now. The rental market's softening anyway. We're going to talk about that too. So if you're a big time landlord, you got a lot of properties, you need to listen. Sean Rakic, I'm a short-term rental expert. I'm going to talk to you about that. Let's jump in. Thank you for tuning into this video, guys. I know that you're probably going to disagree with me on the front end, but stick around. I've got some real logic here that you need to consider. So there's nothing wrong with a front end real estate strategy. Like, for example, I'm just going to use one of the most popular people on YouTube right now, Meet Kevin. He's got his wedge deal course. He teaches you how to buy properties that are cheaper than they should be in the neighborhood, the lagging properties, and he, fixes them up and then forces appreciation. You can get more money out of that property. See, that's good, and that's independent of who lives there. So you can still do a strategy like a wedge deal strategy without ever having to consider what you're going to do as far as your rental income, okay? So I'm not saying abandon anything like that. If you want to do BRRRR, fix and flips, where actually you fix, put a tenant in there and then flip it, you can do stuff like that without having to really change your front end strategy. But the back end, once you have the property available for rent, you need to be making an adjustment here, like a big fat adjustment, because the amount of cash you're generating off of a regular tenant is not worth the squeeze. And I do short-term rentals, and I want to tell you that short-term rentals is worth your time by far and above your regular long-term rental strategy. And a lot of people, the reason why they first don't get into short-term rentals is they've got like two main objections usually. One is it's too much work, and two, it's too risky. So let's talk about the risk first. Regular tenants are risky just the same. If you consider how much cash positive you're getting out of a property combined with the risk that you take on with a tenant, there's going to be like a risk and return score that you could give your property. If you're breaking even $0 of like cash flow above your debt paydown, that's a really risky play with a tenant. So if you've got a tenant that's paying $1,300 a month and your mortgage and taxes and insurances are $1,300 a month, then you're basically just paying down your debt and that's it. Now, if that guest ever defaults on their rent and you have to evict them, you now start to lose a ton of money. Or if the guest does, or if the tenant does a bunch of damage to your property down the road, you're gonna lose a ton of money again. So you do have the risk of losing money with a long-term tenant. So a lot of landlords, they go for $200 a month cash flow positive above those costs, and that offsets some of their risk. So the logic here, this is what I want you to follow, the logic here is risk is always worth something. The more money you make, the more risk you can take. Okay, that's the trade-off. Now let's say that you put a short-term renter or a short-term tenant or guest in your property. There's gonna be different and more risk for this type of tenant, or you'd think there would be, but there's also more money involved. And so let's look at both sides. First, you need to buy furniture. So not only are you buying the home, but you need to buy or rent furniture. That's an additional upfront cost. And you're holding the utilities, internet, electricity, stuff like that. So there's a little bit more to manage there, but all that stuff can be auto draft, right? So it's not really that big of a deal. Then the guests could do more than just damage the property. They could damage the furniture as well. And you need to upkeep that furniture and keep it in good condition because every single short-term guest expects a good property. So there are insurances for this, and there are resolutions on Airbnb, for example, because you can use Airbnb to get these tenants, and that's really the main way a lot of people do get short-term renters, and they will guarantee your property, so that way up to $1 million in damage. So there's a lot of ways to curb that out. In my experience, we have issues where we have to replace stuff like way under 1% of the time, anything significant. We might have to replace towels or cups, wine glasses, stuff like that here and there, maybe a lost TV remote, but that's still less than 1% of the time too. So the stuff that might actually happen is like stained towels, you know what I mean? So there's gonna be a little bit of activity there, but the risk isn't really big, and you can ask the guest to pay you that 10 or 15 or 20 bucks for that stuff too. It's all part of your business process at that point. So a guest is going to pay you 2x or 3x your regular rent. Like if you're going to collect $1,500 in rent per month from a, like a long-term tenant, you should be collecting $3,000, hopefully even $4,500. That should be your range of what you're generating in cash off of short-term rental. So there's a lot more money getting jammed in. And so a lot of people are like, well, you have to be like 100% occupied for this to be worth your time. Well, if you just did the math, if you generate at least 2x the amount of money that you would normally get with a regular tenant, then at about 50% occupancy, you're pretty much par for the course, minus some expenses. So if you're 60, 65% occupied, you're good, you're gold, right? And there are weekends that tend to stay full at a higher premium, so you will actually break even under 50% because your weekends are almost, usually the stuff that gets booked in metro areas like where I am, or vacation areas where people go skiing in the winter. So you won't have to worry so much about occupancy being your problem, and you as a landlord, that's probably where a lot of your bias is, because one of the biggest expenses of being a long-term tenant landlord is tenant turnover. Somebody moves out, you've got to fix the place, you've got to get a real estate agent to find a new tenant sometimes, that sign in the yard doesn't always work, and you could go multiple months without a tenant in a bad economy. So short-term rentals, you'll go a day or 2 or 3 without tenants all the time. And we talk about this in a lot of my videos on this channel, but you should never go a week. You should never go 10 days without tenants. That means you're just not running your business well. So a well-run short-term rental strategy will make you more money, have good consistent occupancy, you can vet your guests to make sure you don't let trash in, people that don't damage your property, and in the case that people do some damages to your property, there is recourse to get that money back, so you're not losing money on these damages, there's gonna be extra work. So that brings up the second objection that a lot of landlords have, which is that it's just too much work. Well, if you are a new investor, right? You're buying your first or second real estate property, you should have some free time. You should definitely have some free time that you can be at the property here and there, and that you can communicate with guests when they have a question about whether or not your pool is heated or whether or not they can fit 2 cars on the driveway. This kind of stuff you can just do from your phone. You could be working at Target, texting people back, like on your breaks and in between customers when you're ringing up groceries. You can text people, yeah, we can handle that, or you can come in a little bit early, or sure, here's the code for the front door. That stuff is work remote, and it's like super hands-off anyway. So the only stuff that you really need to be available for is housekeeping if you do it yourself. Otherwise, you can hire a housekeeping company, and eventually you want to in-house that, but for now, if you have another job and you can't clean the home yourself, that's cool. Just pay a professional cleaner, and you're still going to make money on top of your nightly rate, because Airbnb allows you to charge a cleaning fee. So does VRBO, Booking.com. It's kind of par for the course, and people pay those cleaning fees on top of your nightly rate. And as you do this, you're going to notice that by being available for these guests, which isn't really a big deal, and your housekeeper's doing a good job, like they're the ones that let you know if anything is stolen or missing, you're going to end up finding that running 1, 2, or 3 Airbnbs is a really smooth endeavor. So having 3 short-term rentals isn't really that much work. I'd say it's about as much work to run 1 as it is to run 3, so there's a step up. Your first property, you're gonna have to do stuff you've never done before as a landlord. You're gonna have to communicate with your tenants all of the time and be available by phone sometimes. But up to like 3, 4, or 5 properties, there's very little bit more work. But if you're generating net cash flow, an extra $1,200 or an extra $1,500 per month net cash flow profit above and beyond what you would normally get from a regular tenant, well, how much does your job pay you? You make $60,000, $80,000 a year. If you make that much money, I think still that's pretty good income, par for the course in the country right now, including the fact that like 8 million people slipped into poverty during COVID-19. Unemployment is super high still. All these factors actually matter. So if you have a $50,000 a year job, you're probably on the good end of it in the American economy anyway. And so, well, how much is $50,000 a year? That's like $1,000 a week. So with 3 or 4 Airbnb properties that generate you net positive cash flow of more than $1,000 a month on top of your debt paydown, you're already making more than your job at that point. So you could just not have a job and run your 3 or 4 Airbnb properties, and you can grow from there. So I would highly encourage you, keep your job, get 3 or 4 properties, and then start investing in 5th, 6th, 7th property. And if you don't want to spend 20% on a down payment for all these extra properties, because that's expensive, you could do rental arbitrage like me, where I don't buy the properties. But this is not going to be a rental arbitrage how-to video. There are other ones on the channel, but there's ways to grow. And you can make that $800, $1,200, $1,500 a month per month in profit on someone else's property. And then you can scale and quit your job. that's great. Now, if you're a big shot real estate investor with multifamily and tons of single family homes, and you already see the writing on the wall, and you can't even argue with me on this, you see the rental market softening in tons of cities around the country. I just got off the phone with like a national director of a property management company that has like hundreds and hundreds of doors, and they're seeing San Francisco, all the cities in California, all the cities on the East Coast softening up as people are moving out of the city because people are working remote. Texas is doing fairly well, but the building I'm in right now has been open for almost a year, and they're 29% occupied. That's right, 200 doors plus, and they're 29% occupied. The people who built this property are probably furious that they're hemorrhaging money. And this happens all the time when the rental market goes into the tank. And like Houston, for example, my first city that I ever Airbnb'd in, they're highly reliant on oil. So when Shell and Exxon like lay everybody off, there goes your rental market, right? And so what you need is you need a way to pivot fast. Because if the rental market softens in your area and you end up like having an issue where your tenant turnover gets really, really expensive, it would be cheaper for you to buy furniture and put furniture in that property, offer it as a furnished rental for long-term tenants when you have them, and then short-term rental when you don't have a long-term tenant. See, what I'm telling you is you can still prioritize a long-term tenant if that's your game, right? If you can get a 1 year, 2 year long lease from a tenant, go for it. But in the 1 month, 2 month, 3 months, 4 months between, you can put short-term tenants in at a high margin, high markup, and that'll make you money on your property instead of you losing money on the property in the meantime. Plus, you can be more patient for the right tenant, which means you don't have to pay a real estate agent to represent your property to find you a tenant and then pay them 1 month of rent commission. You can take a little bit more time, right? You can have a property manager find you a tenant, you know, kind of more through osmosis with like a sign in the yard and like a Facebook marketplace ad, stuff like that. But you may choose to never go back to long-term tenants because you like to have access to the property every week, to audit the property, to make sure that it's still in good repair. Because if you've ever had a disaster tenant that trashes the home, you also know that that's a huge headache and it's an unexpected cost. And having an unexpected $10,000 renovation is something that's terrible for your real estate portfolio. If you're not making much cash flow on top of your tenants already, having to come out of pocket 10 grand is not fun. Unless it's a down payment for a new property, and that's what you want to save that 10 grand for. So take your big portfolio of multifamily and single family homes and mix in a percentage of short-term rental like guests. And because of the objection, let's finally round to this objection that it's too much effort, it takes too much time. If you have a big portfolio anyway, you can hire a property manager to do this extra work. My budget for management is $40 per week per door. So that's $160, $175 per month per property that I'm putting on the short-term rental market. And if you're making an extra $1,200 per month net on a property, shave off $175 and give that to a manager, you can still get an extra $1,000 net. And that management does it all. They handle all of your guests, they handle like inventory restocking, hiring your housekeepers, managing your housekeepers if you in-house them like me. They handle resolutions when a guest owes money for stuff, they handle it all. So you can still be passive, just as passive as if you have long-term tenants. You just have to have a layer in between you and those guests. And you stop having to worry about evictions. That's really cool. So you're trading one problem for another. The perceived problem of higher activity or higher turnover, day-to-day turnover, you're trading that for no longer having to give somebody a lease. Right? How cool is that? You could be a landlord with 1,000 properties and never have to give somebody the power of a lease. When tenants have a lease in a lot of states, they've got a lot of power. And you can just cut that right out and you have short-term tenants that you don't have to worry about evicting and you just move them out if they don't pay you. That is intense. And so this is why your strategy needs to change. You can buy all the property you want. I'm not going to pitch you on rental arbitrage, like more for me, more properties for me, for landlords that don't want to do short-term rentals. But if you are holding your own property and you're seriously concerned about whether or not the rental market's going to affect your occupancy, or if you're thinking about buying a property and you don't know anything about having a tenant right now, you might as well learn how short-term rentals works, because it sucks to screw up with your first tenant and that person you have to evict. There are so many landlords that will tell you that their biggest first mistake, aside from buying like the wrong property, is they got the wrong first tenant. And it was a nightmare, and they lost money for 10 months or a year trying to figure out how to evict their first tenant who never paid rent like after month 2. That happens way too often. Short-term rentals is by far safer for those who don't know much. So if you have questions, put them in the comments. I'm here for you guys. Anything you want to know, short-term rentals, rental arbitrage, Airbnb, you know, the usual. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you on the other side.